My name doesn't matter yet. What matters is that 3 days after my grandmother's funeral, my mother-in-law sat at my own dining table in my own house and told me, with a smile, that the family had already decided my inheritance would be better, managed by my husband's side of the family, not held for me, not shared with me, managed, as if I were a child who couldn't be trusted with her own name on a piece of paper. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I am not a woman who raises her voice. I am not a woman who slams doors or throws plates or screams in parking lots. I was raised to nod, to pour the coffee, to say, of course, even when everything inside me was screaming otherwise. That is exactly why they thought I would let this happen. That is exactly why they were wrong. Because what none of them knew, what not one single person sitting at that table knew, was that my grandmother had never trusted them, not for one single day. And she had left behind something that would turn their little family meeting into the beginning of their worst nightmare. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand exactly how deep this betrayal went before you understand exactly how far I was willing to go to answer it. My grandmother Eleanor raised me, not helped raise me, raised me. My parents were gone by the time I was 9, a car accident on a rainy October night that I still cannot think about without my chest tightening. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She didn't call a family meeting to discuss options. She drove 3 hours the same night, walked into that hospital waiting room, and told the social worker that I was coming home with her. That was the kind of woman she was. She did not ask permission from the world. She simply acted. She raised me in a small house with a big garden, and she taught me 2 things above everything else. The first was this: never let anyone make you feel small in a room you built yourself. The second was this: paper outlasts promises. Write everything down. Sign everything properly. Never, ever rely on someone's word when their signature is available instead. I didn't understand how important that second lesson was until I was 34 years old, sitting at my own dining table, watching my husband's family carve up my grandmother's legacy like it was a turkey at Thanksgiving. Let me introduce the players, because every good story of betrayal needs its cast. My husband, Daniel, charming, in the way that men who have never had to fight for anything are charming. Handsome enough that people forgive him things. I married him 8 years ago, back when I still believed that family meant something warm, something safe. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. His mother, Patricia, the kind of woman who compliments your dress, and then asks if you've considered a smaller size. The kind of woman who remembers every favor she's ever done for you and forgets every sacrifice you've made for her. Patricia had one goal in life. As far as I could tell, keep everything inside the family. And by family, she meant blood. Her blood, not mine, and his sister Vanessa, newly divorced, deeply in debt, and, as I would later discover, the true architect of what happened next. Vanessa smiled at me at every holiday dinner, while quietly building a case against me behind my back. I didn't know that yet. I was about to find out. My grandmother passed in early spring, 81 years old, sharp as a blade until the very last week. I was with her when she went. She held my hand and said something I didn't fully understand at the time. Everything you need is already yours. They just don't know it yet. I thought it was the morphine talking. I was wrong. Every word of it was deliberate. The funeral was small, quiet, exactly how she would have wanted it. I stood at the front, and Daniel stood beside me, his hand on my back in a way that felt supportive at the time. I didn't yet know that hand belonged to a man who had already had 3 private phone calls with his mother about next steps before the flowers. On her grave had even wilted. 3 days later came the dinner that changed everything. Patricia arrived early, which should have told me something. She let herself in, a habit I'd tried and failed to break for years, and began setting the table herself, as though this were her house and not mine. Vanessa arrived 20 minutes later carrying a bottle of wine and a folder. A folder? Who brings a folder to a family dinner? I should have known right then. But grief makes you slow. Grief makes you trusting in exactly the moments you cannot afford to be. We sat. We ate. Small talk about nothing. The weather. A cousin's new job. Whether the roast was too dry. And then, right as I was clearing the plates, Patricia set her fork down with a small, deliberate click and said the words that started this entire war. Sweetheart, we need to talk about Eleanor's estate. I remember my hands going still over the dishes. I remember Daniel not meeting my eyes. I remember Vanessa opening that folder like she'd been waiting all night for the cue. We've talked it over. Patricia continued. And we think it's best if the assets are held collectively. For the family. You understand, Mike, you're wonderful, dear. But you've never managed anything like this before.
Henry wouldn't want it mismanaged.
Mismanaged, as if a lifetime of raising me, teaching me, building something with her own 2 hands, could be reduced to a risk assessment by a woman who had never once asked how. I was doing since the funeral. Vanessa slid a paper across the table. A rough outline, unofficial, but unmistakably a plan. A plan to route my grandmother's assets into something called a family holding, with Patricia as trustee and Daniel and Vanessa as beneficiaries. My name appeared exactly once, in small print, as a secondary party, advisory only. Advisory only, in my own inheritance, from my own grandmother. I looked at Daniel. I waited for him to say something, anything, to defend me the way a husband is supposed to defend his wife. He looked down at his plate and said, very quietly, "It just makes things simpler, that's all. Less stress for you, less stress for me," as if erasing me from my own inheritance was a gift. I want to tell you, I stood up right then and told them all to get out of my house. I didn't, not yet. Grief had made me quiet. And quiet is a dangerous thing to mistake for weak. I said I needed time to think. Patricia smiled, that same tight, satisfied smile, and said, "Of course. Take all the time you need. We'll just get the paperwork ready in the meantime." They left that night believing the matter was essentially settled, believing that I, the quiet, grieving granddaughter, would simply sign whatever they placed in front of me. They had no idea what they'd just done, because the moment that door closed behind them, I stopped being quiet in my head. I went straight to the small fireproof box my grandmother had given me 2 years earlier, the one she'd made me promise to keep somewhere safe and never mention to anyone. I had never opened it. She told me I would know when the time was right. The time was right. Inside was a letter, sealed, with my name written in her unmistakable handwriting. And beneath the letter, a business card for a law office 3 towns over, a name I had never heard. Daniel or Patricia or Vanessa mentioned even once in 8 years of family dinners. I sat on my kitchen floor at 11 at night and read that letter twice before I could even process what it meant. My grandmother had not left her estate to be divided by a family meeting. She had not left it, vulnerable to whoever spoke the loudest at a dinner table. Years before she passed, years before I'd even married, Daniel, she had quietly established an irrevocable trust. Not a simple will. A trust sealed, funded, and structured in a way that made it essentially untouchable by outside claims. And she had done it, she wrote, because she had never fully trusted the family I married into. Not their intentions, not their patience, not their character. They will try to take what isn't theirs, she wrote. They always do, with people who don't have anyone standing behind them. But you do, you have me even after I'm gone. Go to this office. Bring nothing but yourself and your birth certificate. They already know what to do. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with that letter until the sun came up, and for the first time since the funeral, I didn't feel like the fragile, grieving girl everyone at that dinner table had assumed I was. I felt something else entirely. Something sharper. The next morning, I called the number on the card before I'd even had coffee. The woman who answered didn't sound surprised to hear from me. If anything, she sounded like she'd been expecting the call for years. "We wondered when you'd find the letter," she said. "Your grandmother was very specific about the timing. Can you come in this afternoon?" I sat in a small office lined with law books an hour later, across from an attorney named Marguerite Hale, a woman with silver hair and the kind of calm, unshakable presence that made you feel like nothing in the world could rattle her. She slid a thick folder across the desk. My folder. Not Vanessa's flimsy little outline, a real, binding, fully executed legal document. "Your grandmother came to us 11 years ago," Marguerite said. "Before you were even married. She told us, and I remember this clearly, that she wanted to protect you from a family that hadn't shown their true colors yet, but that she suspected would eventually. She said, and I quote, 'Grief makes people show you exactly who they are. I want my granddaughter protected before that day comes.' 11 years. She had seen this coming 11 years before it happened, before Daniel had ever proposed, before Patricia had ever called me dear in that voice that meant the opposite. My grandmother had looked at a family I hadn't even married into yet and known, somehow, exactly what they were capable of. Marguerite walked me through it piece by piece. The trust held the house, the investment accounts, a small commercial property Eleanor had quietly purchased decades ago, and never once mentioned at a single holiday dinner. And this was the detail that made my stomach drop, a controlling interest in a family business that Patricia's side had always assumed belonged entirely to them. That last part needs explaining, because this is where the story stops being simply about grief and inheritance and starts being about consequences. Years earlier, before I was even in the picture, my grandmother had been a silent investor in a small but growing property management company, the very same company that Patricia's late husband had built, and that Daniel now ran the daily operations of. Eleanor's investment had kept that business afloat during a downturn that almost sank it entirely. In exchange, she had quietly negotiated a percentage of ownership, structured through a holding company most of the family had never heard of and never bothered to ask about because, frankly, no one imagined the quiet widow with the garden and the modest house was sitting on anything worth asking about. They had spent years assuming that business was entirely theirs. They had spent years making decisions, taking profits, planning expansions, all without knowing that roughly a quarter of what they controlled legally belonged to someone else. And upon Eleanor's death, that quarter, along with the authority that came with it, didn't go to the family. It went into the trust, my trust, with me as the sole beneficiary and decision-maker the moment. I turned 35, a birthday exactly 6 weeks away. I sat in that office and felt something shift inside me. Not rage, not yet. Something colder and more useful than rage, clarity. They don't know any of this, I said. Marguerite shook her head slowly. Your grandmother was very deliberate about that, she said. And again, I'm quoting her almost exactly. Let them show me who they are first. Then let her decide what to do with what she finds. Let them show me who they are first. She had built a test. And 3 nights earlier, sitting at my own dining table, they had failed it spectacularly, trying to strip me out of my own inheritance, before the ink on the death certificate was even dry. I want to be honest with you about what I felt walking out of that office. It wasn't triumph. Not yet. It was something quieter and heavier. The particular grief of realizing that the woman who raised me had, in her final years, quietly prepared a shield for me against people I hadn't yet learned to be afraid of. She had seen the wolves in sheep's clothing years before. I ever let one of them into my bed, my home, my life. I drove home that day and did not say a single word to Daniel about what I'd learned. Instead, I did something my grandmother had taught me better than anyone. I watched, quietly, carefully. I let them believe they were still winning. Over the following 2 weeks, I attended 2 more family meetings without revealing a single thing. I nodded along as Patricia described her plans for the family. Holding, I watched Vanessa sketch out how she intended to use her share to pay off debts she'd never once mentioned to me directly. I watched Daniel, my husband, sit silently through every single one of these conversations, never once speaking up for me, never once asking if perhaps his wife deserved more than advisory only status in her own grandmother's legacy. That silence told me everything I needed to know about the last 8 years of my marriage. During those 2 weeks, I met with Marguerite 3 more times. We prepared everything. Not to attack, not yet, but to be ready for the exact moment they tried to force my hand. Because I knew, with the certainty of someone who had watched this family operate for 8 years, that they would eventually try to get my signature on something. And the moment they did, that would be the moment everything came out into the light. It happened on a Sunday evening, 17 days after the funeral. Patricia called what she described as a final family meeting to finalize. Arrangements, same dining table, same folder, thicker now, with actual legal language drafted by a lawyer. I would later learn Vanessa had found through a co-worker, someone with no real experience in trust or estate law, someone who clearly hadn't done even the most basic due diligence on what they were attempting to move. They slid the paperwork across the table toward me with the practiced ease of people who had done this exact maneuver before, on someone else in some other family, at some other point in their lives. I recognized the pattern the second I saw it. This wasn't their first time trying this. It was simply their first time trying it on the wrong person. It's mostly a formality, Patricia said, smiling that same smile. Just needs your signature here and here, transferring the assets into the family trust for proper management. I picked up the pen. I want you to sit with that moment for a second, because I know exactly how it looked to them, the quiet, grieving wife, finally caving, finally doing what was expected of her. I set the pen down without signing a single line. "I have something I need to show all of you first," I said. I will never forget the silence that followed. Patricia's smile faltering by exactly 1 degree. Vanessa's eyes flicking toward Daniel. Daniel himself sitting up a little straighter, sensing perhaps for the first time in 8 years that something about his wife had changed. I opened my own folder, the real one, Marguerite's folder, and slid it across the table. I explained it slowly, deliberately, the way my grandmother had taught me to explain anything important. Without raising my voice, without rushing, letting every single word land exactly where it needed to. I explained the trust, the 11 years of planning, the letter she'd left me, and then I explained the part that made Patricia's face go pale and Daniel's hands go, still on the table, the quarter ownership of the very business he ran, the business he'd built his entire identity around, the business that had for years been operating with a silent partner none of them had bothered to properly investigate. As of today, I said, I'm the sole trustee and beneficiary of everything in this folder, which means, as of today, I control the decision-making rights attached to that ownership stake, which means, Daniel, that the business you run, the one you've been planning to expand using funds you assumed were entirely yours to allocate, now requires my approval for any major decision going forward. I watched 8 years of assumed superiority drain out of that room in real time. Patricia's voice, when it finally came, was sharp in a way I'd never heard before. This is ridiculous. Eleanor would never... Eleanor did, I said quietly. 11 years ago, before I even married into this family. She saw exactly what you'd try to do, and she made sure you couldn't do it. Vanessa reached for the folder, flipping through pages with increasing panic. Looking, I imagine, for some loophole, some technicality, some way this could still be undone. There wasn't one. Marguerite had made absolutely certain of that. And Daniel, my husband, the man who had sat silently through weeks of his family trying to erase me from my own inheritance, finally spoke, not to defend me, not even to apologize. He turned to his mother and said, "You told me this was handled. You told me she wouldn't find out until it was already done. You told me she wouldn't find out until it was already done." 8 years of marriage, and in that single sentence, I understood exactly what I had actually been to this family the entire time. Not a wife, not a daughter-in-law, an obstacle to be managed quietly, before I could notice what was being taken from me. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, not there at that table. I simply closed the folder, stood up, and said the only thing that needed saying. You had 17 days to treat me like family. Instead, you spent them trying to steal from me. So now you'll deal with me as exactly what I am. The person who controls a quarter of everything you built your life around. I filed for divorce 11 days later. Marguerite handled the trust matters. A separate attorney, on Marguerite's recommendation, handled everything with Daniel. And because of exactly how that business ownership was structured, because of exactly how carefully my grandmother had built her shield 11 years before any of this began, Daniel and Patricia found themselves needing my approval for decisions they had spent years assuming were entirely, permanently theirs. I won't pretend the months that followed were easy. Divorce never is, even from a marriage that had quietly stopped being real long before I understood it. But I want you to understand something about how this story ends, because it isn't really about the business, or the trust, or even the money. It's about what my grandmother knew 11 years before I did, that the people who love you loudest at holiday dinners are not always the people who will protect you when it actually matters. That paper outlasts promises. That the quiet ones, the ones who nod, and pour the coffee and say, of course, are sometimes simply waiting for the right moment to stop being quiet at all. 6 weeks after that dinner, on my 35th birthday, the trust fully vested in my name, exactly as my grandmother had planned it 11 years before I ever needed it. I sat in her garden that evening, the one she'd taught me to tend since I was 9 years old, and I finally let myself cry. Not from grief. Not entirely, but from something closer to gratitude. She had seen the wolves before I could, and she had made absolutely certain that when they finally showed their teeth, I would be the one left standing. They thought I was the quiet granddaughter who would sign whatever was placed in front of her. They had no idea I came from a woman who never let anyone make her feel small in a room. She built herself, and neither in the end did I.
Thank you for watching this video. If you like this video, please don't forget the subscribe the channel for new videos, upcoming new videos every day. Thank you. Bye.